The sound was deafening, a relentless chopping that seemed to split the sky itself. The helicopter blades sliced through the air with mechanical precision, carrying within its cabin a storm of tension that no one but her could feel. The altitude was dizzying, but she had trusted the man beside her, her husband, the man she believed would always keep her safe. Trust was supposed to be her anchor, yet at that very moment it became her undoing. Without warning, without words, his hands moved with a violent certainty. The push was sharp, cruel, and deliberate. For a fraction of a second, she thought it was a mistake, an accident born of turbulence. But the look in his eyes before she was hurled into the open sky told a truth more piercing than the rushing wind. This was betrayal. Not just a slip of his hands, but a cold, calculated attempt to erase her existence. The air seized her body instantly. Wind roared past her ears, pulling at her clothes, dragging her into an abyss with merciless force. The world blurred, sky above, land below, clouds whipping by in a dizzying dance of terror. Every second stretched into eternity. Her lungs refused to fill, her scream was stolen by the sheer violence of the descent. Her mind fractured between disbelief and primal instinct. How could love end like this? How could promises of forever collapse into a free fall of death? The man she once kissed goodnight, the man whose vows she once clung to, had become her executioner. Somewhere in that infinite fall, a haunting question etched itself into her spirit, one that would not fade even if her body shattered on impact. What happens when your greatest love becomes your deadliest danger? And as the ground rushed up to meet her, the answer remained as elusive as the wind itself, waiting to be written not in the skies she fell through, but in the life she was determined, against all odds, to reclaim. Before she became the woman plummeting from the sky, she was a girl with dreams that seemed too vast for the small neighborhood where she was raised. Born into a world that often tried to clip the wings of black women before they even learned to fly, she carried ambition in her bones. Her mother worked double shifts as a nurse, her father balanced odd jobs, and together they instilled in her a fierce belief that resilience was not optional, it was survival. From classrooms where her voice was dismissed to workplaces where her presence was questioned, she learned early that she would have to fight twice as hard for half the recognition. Yet she never allowed bitterness to define her. Instead, she wore determination like armor. She studied hard, built friendships carefully, and carried a vision of a future where she would not just survive but thrive. College opened doors, and though money was tight, scholarships and her relentless will kept her moving forward. By the time she met him, the man who would later betray her, she had already weathered storms that would have drowned others. He came into her life like sunlight after rain, charismatic, attentive, and magnetic in ways she couldn't resist. He spoke of love as if it were a kingdom he wanted to build with her at its center. Flowers arrived at her doorstep, handwritten notes filled with promises of forever, whispered declarations that she was his world. For a young woman accustomed to proving her worth, his adoration felt like a long-awaited validation. In the early years, their relationship was intoxicating. Candlelit dinners, shared dreams, laughter that echoed into the night. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, cracks began to show. His questions about where she was going turned into commands about where she should be. His generosity became laced with conditions, his protection blurred into possession. Financial dependency crept in when he convinced her to leave her job, assuring her that he would take care of everything. She rationalized it. Wasn't this what love meant, to lean on one another? The red flags fluttered quietly at first, easy to ignore when weighed against the memory of his early tenderness. She told herself he was just stressed, just protective, just a man with flaws like anyone else. Each excuse bound her tighter, until freedom seemed like an indulgence rather than a right. When he suggested the helicopter ride, she didn't question it. He framed it as a romantic gesture, a thrilling escape above the world they had built together. She smiled, believing his words, choosing trust over doubt as she so often had. She didn't know that the very flight meant to symbolize their shared heights would become the setting for her most brutal fall, one that would strip away every illusion she had once held about him, about love, and about herself. The helicopter lifted smoothly from the ground, its body shuddering as it fought against gravity before finding its rhythm in the open air. Below them, the world shrank into a patchwork of roads, rivers, and fields. She pressed her forehead lightly to the window, trying to steady the excitement fluttering in her chest. He had told her this flight was a gift, a celebration of their journey together. Yet something about his silence unsettled her. In the past, he would have leaned in close, whispering sweet words into her ear, making her laugh to distract her from the nervousness of flying. But this time, there were no smiles, no soft touches, no reassurances. His face was carved into stone, his eyes unreadable. She tried to reach for his hand, but he pulled away, his attention fixed on some point beyond her. Her unease grew heavier with every passing second. The hum of the rotors seemed louder, harsher, amplifying the tension in the small cabin. She asked him if something was wrong, her voice trembling against the noise. His response was chilling in its absence. No words, just the slow, deliberate turn of his head to meet her gaze. For an instant, she thought she saw regret flicker in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by something colder. And then it happened. He leaned toward her, but not with affection. His hands, once symbols of comfort, now became instruments of violence. The shove was sudden, precise, and merciless. She gasped, the world tilting violently as the cabin door gave way to endless sky. The moment her body left the safety of the aircraft, time seemed to splinter. Disbelief seared through her chest. This can't be happening. The man who once vowed to protect her life was now orchestrating her death. The betrayal cut deeper than the wind tearing past her skin. As she plummeted, confusion warred with terror. Her heart screamed for answers that would never come. This wasn't just a fall from the sky, it was a collapse of everything she had built her identity upon. The trust she had placed in him, the marriage she had nurtured, the love she had defended, they all disintegrated with every second of her descent. In those few, eternal moments between life and death, she wasn't just losing altitude. She was being stripped of illusions, free-falling through betrayal, and hurtling toward a truth she had never wanted to face. The man she loved had become her greatest danger. The fall should have killed her. Gravity had claimed thousands before her, and yet, by some unfathomable twist of fate, it did not claim her. As the ground surged closer, she braced for the inevitable end, her body locked in terror. Instead of a fatal impact on jagged rocks, her plunge was interrupted, first by the sharp slap of tree branches, each one slowing her descent by fractions of seconds that meant the difference between life and death. Leaves tore at her skin, wood splintered against her arms and legs, but the branches broke her fall just enough. She crashed finally into a shallow marsh, the water cold, muddy, and unwelcoming, but life-saving all the same. Pain arrived in waves, crashing harder than her body ever could. Her ribs screamed with every breath, her left arm hung limp and useless, and bruises blossomed across her skin with a violence that mirrored the betrayal she had just endured. She tasted iron in her mouth, felt the sting of cuts across her face, and yet, astonishingly, she was alive. Broken, yes. Battered, yes. But alive. She tried to move, every inch of her body protesting. Crawling through mud, dragging herself from the water's edge, she felt more like a wounded animal than a woman. Her breaths came in ragged sobs, not just from pain but from the overwhelming realization that she had survived the impossible. Survival, however, was not the same as safety. She was stranded, miles from help, in a body that begged to give up. As she lay shivering, half-conscious on the forest floor, flashes of memory pierced through her agony. Her husband's words from years ago, "You don't need anyone but me." His subtle manipulations disguised as love, "Let me handle the money, you shouldn't stress yourself." The times he silenced her voice with charm and control, each moment now unraveling in the harsh light of truth. She saw his patterns clearly for the first time, the web he had woven around her life, leading up to this ultimate act of erasure. And yet, she had not been erased. The symbolism was undeniable. She had fallen from the sky, thrown away like something disposable, but the earth had caught her in its rough, unyielding embrace. She was bruised, blooded, and gasping for air, but she was not broken. Somehow, she understood, this fall was not the end of her story. It was the violent, painful beginning of something else, something she would not yet name, but would one day own. Not far from where her broken body lay, fate was weaving a thread she could never have imagined. The man who would become her unlikely savior was not a pilot, not a medic, but a billionaire with a reputation for appearing where people least expected him. His fortune had been built on innovation and persistence, but wealth alone did not define him. Known for his humanitarian ventures, he often sought remote places, funding projects that brought clean water, education, and medical aid to underserved communities. That day, his helicopter was not meant to intersect with her tragedy. He had been overseeing a nearby land development meant to fund schools, a rare moment when business and philanthropy crossed paths. But as his team prepared to return, a faint emergency signal from the marshlands below caught their attention. At first, he thought it was a technical error, until he saw the broken trees and the unnatural disturbance in the wet earth. Something, or someone, had fallen from the sky. The billionaire insisted on investigating. Against the cautious warnings of his security detail, he descended into the wilderness. There, half submerged in mud, he found her. A woman barely conscious, clothes torn, face streaked with blood and tears, yet eyes flickering with the stubborn light of life. When she saw him leaning over her, she thought she was hallucinating. His presence seemed impossibly out of place, like a figure pulled from another world. She tried to speak, her voice breaking, but he silenced her gently. "Save your strength," he said, his tone steady, as if certainty itself lived in his voice. For the first time since her fall, she felt the fragile stirrings of safety. Many would have turned away. A woman injured, mysterious, with no explanation for her presence in the wilderness, trouble in the making. But he didn't. Something about her, perhaps the quiet resilience even in her battered state, or the silent plea carried in her gaze, stirred a conviction in him. He ordered his team to carry her out, to get her medical attention immediately. In that moment, the story could have ended as a rescue mission, one more good deed in the billionaire's long list of philanthropic efforts. Yet, there was an unspoken gravity in the air, a recognition that this was not chance. This was the beginning of something far greater. For her, it was more than survival, it was the first spark of empowerment, ignited by the most unlikely of allies. The hospital became her battlefield. White walls and sterile air replaced the wilderness, but the fight for survival was far from over. Surgeons worked tirelessly to mend her shattered ribs, to set the broken bones in her arm, to stitch together the cuts left by branches and the cruel hand of fate. The pain was relentless, sharp, burning, a constant reminder of how close she had come to death. Yet even harder to mend were the invisible wounds, the betrayal that gnawed at her spirit, the nightmares that jolted her awake in sweat-soaked terror, the memory of his eyes as he pushed her into the sky. The billionaire did more than pay her hospital bills, though he spared no expense to ensure she had the best care available. He stayed. Not always in the room, but nearby, checking in, asking the doctors questions, ensuring she was never left to navigate her recovery alone. At first, she resisted his presence, suspicious of anyone who offered help so freely. Trust had become a foreign language, one she could no longer speak without fear of deception. But he was patient. He never demanded her gratitude or her story. Instead, he offered quiet companionship, a hand resting lightly on hers when she woke trembling from a nightmare, a steady voice reading aloud when the silence grew unbearable, simple words that reminded her she was not just a patient but a person. Their conversations became a lifeline. He asked her once, during a long evening when the machines hummed softly around them, what she believed survival meant. She hesitated before answering. Survival, she said, was not just breathing, it was finding the strength to reclaim the life someone tried to steal. He nodded, his eyes reflecting a recognition that came from his own battles with loss and ambition. Bit by bit, trust grew where despair had once rooted itself. In therapy sessions, she learned to walk again, her every step echoing resilience. In late-night talks, she relearned the worth of her own voice, a voice her husband had tried to silence. The contrast was undeniable. The man who vowed to protect her had sought to erase her, while this stranger, bound to her by nothing but choice, was giving her a second life. Healing was not linear, but with every stitch, every scar, every halting laugh that returned to her lips, she began to believe that brokenness did not define her. Survival did. Healing her body had been only the first step. Healing her spirit demanded something greater, a reinvention. She could not remain the woman who had been pushed from the sky, defined by betrayal and near death. She had to become someone new, someone who not only survived but thrived. The billionaire saw this in her before she saw it in herself. He became more than her benefactor, he became a mentor. Where once she had been silenced and controlled, he opened doors she never knew existed. He introduced her to rooms filled with visionaries and leaders, not as a charity case but as a woman with ideas worth listening to. At first, she felt like an imposter, her voice trembling, her thoughts cluttered by doubt. But he never spoke for her, he insisted she take the seat, speak her truth, claim her space. Slowly, clarity sharpened within her. She realized that empowerment was not about wealth or status, though those tools mattered. Empowerment was choice. It was the freedom to define herself beyond the roles men had tried to assign her: wife, dependent, victim. She embraced new roles: entrepreneur, advocate, leader. Her transformation was not just internal, it carried symbolic moments that marked her rebirth. Months after her fall, she stood before a helicopter once again. Her legs trembled, her chest tightened with the weight of memory, but she stepped forward anyway. This time, she entered by choice. She sat in the cabin, the blades whirling overhead, and instead of terror, she felt resolve. She had reclaimed the very symbol of her attempted erasure and turned it into proof of her survival. Another moment came when she spoke publicly for the first time. The room was filled with women, some survivors of abuse, some still living in silence. She told them her story, not with bitterness, but with fire. She spoke of betrayal, of falling, of breaking, and of rising again. Her words carried weight because they were raw and unpolished, cut from the truth of her experience. Women wept, women cheered, women stood taller because of her courage. Her advocacy grew into something larger: initiatives to support women escaping abusive relationships, programs to teach financial independence, campaigns to amplify the voices of Black women too often drowned out by systemic inequities. She poured her pain into purpose, building platforms that gave others the freedom she had once been denied. The billionaire watched with quiet pride, never seeking to overshadow her ascent. He had saved her life, yes, but she had transformed it. She became a force he could not have predicted, a leader born not from privilege but from survival, a woman who embodied the truth that empowerment is more than wealth. It is voice. It is freedom. It is choice. The truth could not remain buried forever. When investigators pieced together the story of her miraculous survival, the narrative unraveled with brutal clarity. The helicopter's black box confirmed there had been no malfunction, no turbulence strong enough to explain her fall. Witnesses recalled her husband's controlling behavior, his abrupt financial dealings, his sudden attempt to disappear after the incident. Slowly, a picture emerged, not of a grieving spouse, but of a man exposed. Public exposure came swiftly. Media outlets seized on the story, branding him the husband who tried to murder his wife. Former colleagues and acquaintances whispered of his temper, of the subtle cruelties he inflicted behind closed doors. The empire he had built on charm and deception crumbled beneath the weight of evidence and testimony. Wealth could buy silence for a time, but not forever. This time, justice had its teeth in him. She saw him again in court, months after her survival. The man who once towered over her with authority now sat behind a table, shackled by the law he thought he was above. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, she felt no love, no fear, only a cold detachment. He tried to smirk, tried to summon the power he once wielded over her, but it fell flat. He was no longer her captor. He was simply a man facing the consequences of his choices. Many urged her to testify, to tear him apart with the truth of his betrayal. And she did, clearly, steadily, with the unshakable voice of someone who had rebuilt herself from ashes. But when the trial ended, when the guilty verdict was read, she walked away. She did not wait for his punishment, nor did she celebrate his downfall. Revenge, she understood, was a prison of its own. Her empowerment was not tied to his ruin. Justice mattered, yes, but her true victory lay elsewhere, in her ability to live freely, to inspire others, to rise without carrying his shadow. He had tried to end her life, she chose to build one that eclipsed his memory. That was her reckoning, not revenge, but transcendence. Years passed, and the woman once defined by a single fall was no longer just a survivor, she had become a visionary. The scars on her body remained, quiet reminders etched into her skin, but they no longer told a story of pain. They told a story of rebirth. Where once she had been silenced, she now spoke on stages across the world. Where once she had been isolated, she now stood surrounded by women who saw in her a reflection of their own strength. She built more than a new life, she built platforms for others to rise. With the billionaire's mentorship and her own unyielding drive, she launched initiatives that addressed the struggles she knew too well. Shelters for women fleeing abuse, educational programs teaching financial independence, and mentorship networks for young Black women whose voices too often went unheard. Each project was a seed planted in the soil of her survival, growing into forests of empowerment. Her story became a symbol. For Black women who had been told their pain was invisible, she was proof that visibility was possible and powerful. For survivors who believed they were alone, she stood as a beacon that survival was not the end, but the beginning of something greater. Symbolic moments defined her new horizon. She returned to helicopters, not as a victim, but as a leader traveling to oversee her projects. Each time the blades whirred overhead, she no longer heard betrayal, she heard progress. Each liftoff reminded her that she had risen higher than the man who tried to break her could ever imagine. In interviews, she often said her husband had tried to define her by a single act of violence. But she refused to carry his name or his power any longer. She had written her own narrative, one line at a time, until the fall became just a prologue to a much larger story. And as she stood before an audience one evening, her voice steady, her spirit unshaken, she ended her speech with the words that had come to define her journey. He tried to end her story, but she rewrote it, and now it saves countless others.